If you did not hear my prompt to introduce yourself in the chat box, please do introduce yourself in the chat. This webinar is being co-hosted by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, which is home of Talent Pipeline Management, or TPM, and the Institute for Network Communities, which is home of Next Gen Sector Partnerships, or Next Gen. Our webinar today showcases two methodologies of organizing employers in industry-led partnerships that tackle workforce and other competitiveness needs. Again, Next Gen Sector Partnerships and Talent Pipeline Management. I'm Erin Sparks, President of Sparks Policy Group. I'm going to be your moderator today. I have worked with regions across the country to launch and support industry-led partnerships and have worked with partnerships that have used both of these models. So I'm really excited to get this group together with practitioners in this space. Just as kind of starting us off, in my work in regions, I've heard a lot of buzz, I've seen a lot of buzz in the field about different models, frameworks, tools for industry-led partnerships, especially in the last couple of years, some of that driven by federal funding opportunities. It can be a lot of noise, and it can be hard to cut through that noise to identify what works and what makes a real difference to the companies and the people in your regions. There's not a silver bullet. It's not one size fits all. It's great to have a lot of tools to approach this work, but it's not helpful when the noise gets in the way. So kind of our starting point today is that we really want to get to the substance of the work today. We're going to give a quick snapshot of two different methodologies, and then we're going to ground them in the real experience of two regions, aiming to give you all a better understanding of what tools could help the work in your region. And just scanning through the chat box, we have a lot of practitioners on, and so we want to hear from you all too. We're going to get to that point in our webinar to hear what's working in your regions, how you've used these methodologies or others. I'm going to give a very quick orientation to our time together. If we can pull up the slides, I have a quick agenda to run through. I still see introductions coming through in the chat. Thank you all. So you can go to the next slide. Perfect. So the goals for the webinar today, to learn about these two models for industry-led partnerships, which I've mentioned, cut through that noise, demystify the models, hear from on-ground examples, and get your input on what's working in your region. We want to have time to engage in a lively and interactive conversation. So we're going to start with a few speakers, but we'll be opening it up for peer-to-peer discussion. And we hope that you leave today's webinar with some practical tips, tools, ideas for how to work with industry more effectively on their top challenges and create more meaningful impact. So we're going to start with a snapshot overview of the two models. We're going to hear from Francie Gens, founder and CEO of the Institute for Network Communities. And then we're going to hear from Nikki De Silva, Senior Director of Programs and Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. Both of these models, I just want to say up front, are very robust. And Francie and Nikki could each spend an hour or more on these models. We are not going to get into the step-by-step, all of the detail. We're going to look at the fundamentals, and this is a starting point for sort of identifying if you're curious about learning more and seeing how these two models can work together. Then we're going to get into regional examples. We'll hear from two regions that have used these approaches together. They'll talk about why and how they use these methodologies, their successes, and their takeaways. So we're going to be hearing from Kylie Parks, who is Director of Talent Pipeline Development at the Arvada Chamber of Commerce in Colorado. And then we'll hear from Garrett Sheehan, President and CEO of the Greater New Haven Chamber of Commerce in Connecticut. And then we'll open it up for moderated discussion and Q&A. If you have questions as the panelists are speaking, go ahead and put them in the chat box. We'll monitor those and make sure we get to them in the moderated discussion, but we're going to try not to take away our speakers' time on questions when they're presenting. So we can go to the next slide. Before I turn it over to Francie, I want to set the stage quickly and then with what these two models of industry-led partnerships have in common. Sorry, I think there's a slide before this. Nope. Okay. Maybe it's the next slide after this. Sorry. Perfect. Okay, great. So when we're looking at next gen and TPM, I think there's three shared principles that are helpful to frame the conversation. They share a commitment to industry leadership. They see industry leadership as essential in ensuring that programs are aligned to high demand labor market needs. This goes beyond a traditional industry advisory role in both models. They both focus on building systems, not programs. So they're both focused on mobilizing employers and partners to build more industry-aligned systems that are sustainable over time, not just short-term programmatic solutions. And then third, they both co-design solutions with education and training providers based on employer data. So with that, we're going to get those quick snapshots of both methodologies. We're going to start with next gen sector partnerships, and I'm going to turn it to Francie. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, Erin. Thank you all for being here. And thanks to Nikki and Jamie and the U.S. Chamber team. This webinar, we are so pleased to be offering because I got to say, I'm picking up on what Erin said. For many years, I've heard this from a lot of practitioners in the field who say, we know we need industry to step up. We know we need a systematic approach to addressing workforce needs. Do we have to choose between TPM and Next Gen? Our answer is an emphatic no. These are two complementary models that we want to help more people understand how they can work in concert. But frankly, today is not so much about the sort of the theory and the models, it's about practice and how this stuff really translates on the ground. And I want to preface my remarks by saying, we at Inc. often say that it's about the work and not the brand. You know, NextGen is a codified model because it is distinct from other sector partnership models in a lot of ways. And we always encourage folks to use the model and the brand to the extent that it's useful. But just as we're telling regional teams that the most important ingredient for success in building a strong partnership is checking egos and logos at the door, we encourage you to do the same with the NextGen logo. So I wanted to start with that, to just say that we very much are focused on, how can we help support this work in happening in a more systematic and effective way, and want this webinar to be a chance to really talk about how to do that. So why next-gen sector partnerships? What are they? Where do they come from? Sector partnerships have a long history and have traditionally been a workforce development thing, right? And have been around in many states across the country. I wanted to emphasize that next-gen sector partnerships are a marriage of the best of what has worked from sectoral training partnerships, sectoral training initiatives, and the economic development world of cluster partnerships. Sector partnerships, next-gen sector partnerships specifically, are fundamentally a platform for growing and supporting industry sectors that matter to your regional economy. That means engaging business leaders in helping them co-define, co-invest in their own solutions that will help grow their industry, and aligning partners systematically, K-12, post-secondary education, workforce development, economic development, industry associations. Consider a next-gen sector partnership to be a coordinating body, as well as a forum to activate business leaders to be true partners in this work that is so important. I want to emphasize that next-gen sector partnerships are not just a workforce development thing. Part of the reason why we so emphasize framing the partnership to be an open forum is that we found it's really important, in order for business leaders to engage long-term, we got to let them define the agenda. So next-gen sector partnerships go deep on workforce, and certainly in today's economy, next-gen partnerships have a really heavy emphasis on career awareness and recruitment, on work-based learning, on aligning training programs with industry needs, which is where TPM can be particularly useful. But next-gen sector partnerships also tackle things like infrastructure, supply chain, business-to-business networks, technology adoption, coordination of care in the context of healthcare. The idea is that it's anything that's going to matter in supporting and stabilizing that industry sector and ensuring it's tapped into good jobs. So the three things it does on this slide: it's a way to mobilize business leaders, it's a way to, can we go back just one second, to coordinate across the many different partners and the entities, and it's a long-term platform for collaborative cross-sector problem solving. So it's a way to get stuff done, it's a way of working as opposed to a program or an initiative. If we can go to the next slide, Melinda. I want to also talk about what's different about next-gen sector partnerships, really as distinct from other traditional sector models that some of you might be familiar with. Like the TPM model, we really emphasize the importance of having industry at the center. Not because we want business to call all the shots, but because we need industry to step up in a bigger and more systematic way to be a part of solutions. So we have found that the key ingredient to getting business leaders to stick around for the long haul is letting them co-own and co-define the agenda and really drive the partnership in an authentic way. As I mentioned, this is not just a workforce development play, or I should say not just a training play. The Next Gen Sector Partnership becomes a place to tackle an array of competitiveness needs, though I will say many partnerships in our network squarely focus on workforce because that is the primary concern. What's important is that it's the business leaders defining what the agenda is, as opposed to the public partners that are convening the partnership. That makes all the difference. And this is an integrated team. So it's a forum for education, workforce, and economic development to come together to develop solutions in concert, as opposed to one-off solutions, a program here or there that oftentimes doesn't stick around. So if we go to the next slide, and I'm going to make this quick, as Erin mentioned, this is the teaspoon version of our stuff. There's a lot more in our toolkit that we'll put into the chat. Here's the visual. You've got a center table of business leaders, and this is actually quite literal. Those of you that have active next-gen sector partnerships know that this really matters. Where you set up a central table, this is where industry leaders, and we recommend, this is C-suite decision makers. This is not HR, this is not government affairs. It's a certain kind of business leader who has decision-making power, who can commit on behalf of their company, and who sees that the success of their business is connected to the success of the industry, the success of the region. And they're surrounded by, if we go to the next slide, a coordinated team of community partners or public partners, all of whom have a role to play in supporting the industry. Business leaders define what they want to work on, public partners pitch in to support. And again, if we think literal here, if you imagine a room with a bunch of chairs around the perimeter, business leaders are centered at the table. You've got public partners around the outside, invited to participate through active listening. This doesn't mean they're passive. It doesn't mean they're hands off. It means they're insisting that business leaders step up and step forward in order to get things done. So one more click, and then I know we're getting, I want to make sure we have ample time to talk about TPM. So these things are regional. So next-gen sector partnerships have to follow the economic region of the targeted industry. Statewide, unless you're a very small state, doesn't generally work. And too local is hard to get the stamina needed. So they're partnerships of business leaders fundamentally within a single industry sector. So again, distinct from workforce initiatives that might look at groups of occupations, this is about industry sectors or industry clusters. And they tackle an array of workforce as well as broader competitiveness needs. So they are a platform, a coordinating body, a way of getting stuff done, and a way of getting public-private partnership to be real, to be able to really activate business leaders in a way that goes beyond kind of the traditional advisory roles. So I will stop there and turn it over to Nikki to give an intro to TPM.
Great. Thanks so much, Francie. And thanks to everyone for being here today. I echo much of what Francie said, particularly at the beginning around kind of checking the egos at the door and making this really about how these two frameworks can be helpful for you and your community, and looking at how they can work together, because I do believe, I think we all believe on this, that there is actually some power behind being able to figure out how to utilize both of these frameworks effectively, and kind of use the components that make the most sense for you. So just if we could go to the next slide, and I'll kind of go through these pretty quickly, but similarly, we heard a lot from employers, and being the Chamber of Commerce Foundation, we do work primarily with employers, with local and state chambers of commerce, industry associations, and kind of the traditional ways of engaging employers in making decisions or getting their feedback. wasn't quite working for them, right? Whether that's being in an advisory board role, which Francie talked about, right, of kind of going beyond that piece, whether we're kind of taking direction from government or philanthropic dollars is kind of driving the direction of what business should be doing, or relying on kind of existing secondary labor market information as a way to understand what the true needs of employers are. So TPM, if we could go to the next slide, is really a methodology around being able to take kind of traditional supply chain management, which is an industry best practice. We think about that around products typically, but taking those same concepts as if we have an end customer who's able to accurately and clearly communicate what their needs are, that allows for the entire supply chain or the system to be able to respond effectively and work more effectively together, right? So it's building that communication loop. So if we think about it from a workforce standpoint, it's having employers kind of being that end customer and really understanding what their needs are, to be able to communicate that effectively with workers and learners and with education and training providers and those who provide other supports, to align the system of which a worker or learner might go through to be prepared for the workforce, right? And I have a quick example on the next two slides just to show kind of what TPM can look like in practice. So for our TPM friends on the call, you have seen this, you know this example well, but for our new friends, this is a good one to share. So in Michigan, in the state of Michigan, in the industry sector, also, do we have any Michigan friends on the call? I'd be curious if you want to pop in the chat if you're from Michigan here. But the energy sector was looking at hiring 100 gas and electrical line workers to fill opening positions that were happening because of retirement. And they put out the applications and they received, put out the job posting, excuse me, and they received over 4,000 applications for the job. From that, there were only 50 people who were actually qualified for the role, right? So imagine that your HR department or your companies that you're working with are spending the time to parse through 4,000 applications to find only 50 qualified applicants. Or imagine you're the worker or learner thinking that you're qualified for this job, right? And then you find out that you're not. So they recognized that they had some big challenges on the hiring, the point of hire, right? On how they were communicating what the actual needs were for this role. And also, once they were hiring people, what they were having to spend as far as kind of getting them up to speed, what they called their level 0 onboarding, so that those workers can be prepared for the job at hand. So they were spending about $30,000 per new hire on this, for these roles as they were hiring them in. So a group of the energy companies within the state of Michigan through the Michigan Workforce, or the Michigan Energy Workforce Development Consortium. I might have gotten that acronym incorrect, but they're essentially their collaborative for energy companies within the state, work through the TPM process, and were able to identify some areas of improvement by collecting their data and working through that with their education and training partners to make some changes. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see they were able to do a few things. One was recognizing that energy was not one of the CTE pathways within the state of Michigan. So that meant that they were kind of limiting themselves on when energy was being introduced as even an industry for opportunity or for careers within the state of Michigan. So they're able to engage in more education opportunities earlier on in the pipeline. They were able to reduce the amount of time to the educational time by reevaluating the program and recognizing that there were some duplicative components to it. There was some out-of-date training that was happening. There was some need for some new equipment or some support from employees in the field to come into the classroom to help with some of the training, and overall better prepare people for the roles. And so they were able to see about a 98% retention rate, and eliminate what they called that level 0 onboarding. So they were able to save about $30,000 per new hire. So all in all, being able to better understand what their data was telling them, and work effectively with their education and training partners to develop a program that would help actually prepare people for the workforce and ensure that employers were getting the talent that they need. So if we go to the next slide, just quickly, I think you'll see some similarities between what makes TPM as a workforce development strategy different, some similarities between next gen sector partnerships, as well as really being built on those industry best practices and focus on that employer return on investment. So we are also looking at having employers really leading these efforts, particularly around being able to collect their, what we call their primary labor market information, right? So what is that information you're getting specifically from your employers that are engaged in this work that allows you to really understand what their true needs are around how many people, where do they need them, when do they need them, what skills and competencies do those people need to be successful in those roles, and who are we currently working with to get our talent from, or who isn't at the table that we need to be there. It's very agnostic in the talent sourcing partners as well, and really focused on being able to create that shared value and accountability across the spectrum. And just finally, briefly, I'll show you kind of the 6-part strategy that we utilize for this, which helps bring employers and their partners together through a process of the organization, the data collection, the developing of the solutions together with those community partners and education training partners, and then of course making sure that we're creating solutions that we're also measuring and looking for those opportunities for improvement. I think I might be over on time, but hopefully
that you guys are awesome. It was a challenge. And I do want to say thank you both for giving the high level overview, and I want to mention to the audience that like both of these methodologies have incredibly detailed curriculum, step-by-step guides, toolkits, and which is something that can be part of the follow-up for those who are not familiar with it. But then also there's nuance to making this work on the ground, right? Much less combining the two methodologies and making them work together. So that's where we're going to shift now, is to hearing about how these work on the ground and how they work together on the ground. So I'm going to pass it to Kylie Parks at the Arvada Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks for that setup. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, perfect. All right. Well, to get started, I just want to first give a shout out to my boss, Cami Welch, who is the CEO and president of the Arvada Chamber of Commerce. We would not be here without her, and fortunately, but unfortunately, she is in Mexico enjoying some time off. So good for her, but I wanted to make sure to give her the shout out. And then Bree Grenland is also on this call. She's with the Jeffco Business and Workforce Center, and we are co-conveners in this work of sector partnerships. So happy Bree is on this call too. But where do we get started, I think, is the important piece. So Bold 2026 was our initiative that really launched a lot of this work that we were doing. And goal 1 is really where I oversee and support the work to grow our talent. I think some chambers hopefully are in this renaissance phase of like, what can we do better for business to really get them what they need, and also being that convener and connector between business and partners, which I think both of these programs really highlight well. So the goal number 1 is grow our talent, but we know we're going to control the controllables in that. But then you can see in the goals 2 through 4, those are some things we're working on in terms of advocacy and collaboration outside of the talent space, but are also workforce barriers. So this is kind of where it started back in 2017. Cami was the one who invested her time in training for TPM, and she's currently a facilitator of the TPM process. So she is the huge cheerleader behind this work. If we could go to the next slide. So under our talent initiative, we are working on sector partnerships, but how do we identify what industry we work on? It's really looking at the earnings per job and growing industries. So our state has quality expectations and standards, and that is something we reference. But if you look at this map in general, this is Jefferson County. These are our top growing industries. That bottom line reflects the living wage of an individual living by themselves. And then that second line represents the living wage of an individual with a child. So something that we think about when we're looking at what next sector partnerships are we going to launch, what makes sense, we are looking at living wage, ones that have career pathways, and our growing industries within our region. So that's kind of where you can see if you go to the next slide. We've launched 2 sector partnerships. So we've launched the Metro West Advanced Manufacturing Alliance, and we also launched the Construction Sector Partnership within Jefferson County. Both of these we led with the Next Gen partnership in terms of convening and getting employers to the table. But then we've been leveraging TPM once workforce is identified. And I know we're going to get into some questions after, Erin, so I won't give away all those answers. But one thing, again, is NextGen really can help bring the employers to the table. But then once workforce is identified and they're identifying it through the NextGen process, we are leveraging the TPM process to guide us through. And it's still industry led and still industry at the center, but it's giving them a framework to work through to actually get to what are we trying to reach. And I think this data is a great story, and that's why I put it in here. So when we went through the machinist process, or the TPM process with manufacturing, they identified 3 critical positions, which is in your stage 1. 1 being the machinist, 2 being quality inspectors, and then 3 being engineering. And when we present this data to the Alliance, it was really interesting, and there were a lot of aha moments. And so pulling this data really gave us somewhere to drive to. So when we look at the machinist, you can see in Jeffco and Metro, Denver Metro, they both border each other. There are a ton of jobs, over 2,000, and the total number of employers competing, you can see that there. But where it's concerning and where we want to start working towards is when you look at the education pipeline breakdown, we're down 41% of enrollment from 2017 to 2021. So when we brought this data to the Alliance, everyone was like, holy crap, this is big data. This is a very big gap we need to fill. And one of our partners, being Red Rocks Community College, really took to this. So TPM is a 9-month process. It is a lengthier process, but the immediate data that we were able to show put everybody back on their feet and said, we need to start building capacity in these programs, and we need to make sure as we're starting to promote, we can meet the needs of the demand going forward. So Red Rocks is already thinking through some smaller credentialing that they can work through to get machinists upskilled and start helping support closing that gap before we get to the end result. But this is just one story, and with construction, it was a little different. The interesting part is they are more focused on a verified contractor process. Since construction usually doesn't sit under one roof a lot of the times, they want a verified plumbing. Like, how do we get verified plumbers? How do we get verified roofers, right? And make sure those relationships are solid and they're not going to dip out on us halfway through our project. So we have a lot of work to do, but we are really excited about the momentum of the TPM process within the Next Gen Sector Partnership to help keep momentum. And I'll just end with this, that one of the employers, or a few of our employers in our meeting, they're like, this makes total sense, and we feel like we're actually adding value and doing something within our partnership. And I think that was very rewarding to hear, in terms of like, okay, we're doing the right work and we need to keep progressing forward. So I know I only have a few minutes, but I know we'll have questions too.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kylie. Such a great story, especially having that community college response so quickly. Um, so now we're going to shift and move to Connecticut and hear from Garrett Sheehan at the New Haven Chamber of Commerce. If folks have questions that these presentations have prompted, if y'all can go ahead and drop them in the chat, would love to start to see what ideas or questions this is surfacing for all of you for our open discussion. And I will turn it to Garrett.
Great. Thanks, Erin. It's great to see everyone out there, and thanks for having me do this. I was just thinking, as Kylie was speaking, that it's in some ways kind of funny that we're having this conversation, because when I first started getting into TPM and also Next Gen, it was really a little bit of an oddball idea that the two would work together. And so I'm really excited that we are here at this point, and it is doable. And we've been able to do that in Greater New Haven. So as Erin said, my name is Garrett Sheehan. I'm the president and CEO of the Greater New Haven Chamber of Commerce. We're your typical regional chamber in the sense that we do all the chamber large events, connecting, networking. But like many chambers, we have also a focus on economic growth, and really workforce is a big piece of that. You can go to the next slide. And I became first involved with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, went through their Business Leads Fellowship program, which I highly recommend to anyone who's considered doing that. And the U.S. Chamber is just such a great resource. I remember I connected with them during my first year being at the Chamber, being a CEO, and it was just a great relief to find so many tools and resources. And I immediately got really excited about learning about talent pipeline management and the TPM process. And so signed up, was all excited, ready to go. I myself completed the TPM training. I think I was the last TPM cohort in person for at least a couple of years. I remember being in DC right in February 2020, and everything was just starting to fall apart. But great experience. We completed our session through online training. And then in Connecticut later in 2020, our governor really made a big push around workforce development. He had a workforce council, but they decided to go with next gen sector partnerships. And so that was a completely different concept for me than what I had been practicing on TPM. But as it turned out, there really were a lot of similarities. So I was left in a situation, hey, I've got TPM, I've done this training, I'm really excited to start it, but the state is going with next gen, and they're telling me it's a really good program. So we tried to make the best out of that situation. We didn't want to be fighting upstream, trying to do our own process while the state was going in a different direction. But I did make this small plea to the state officials that I was working with. I said, great, we'll do the next gen regional sector partnerships, but can we please also, in collaboration with that process, do TPM, which I think will work out. And so we were able to start our first collaborative, actually two. We launched both bioscience and manufacturing at the same time, but it was actually our manufacturing collaborative where we had this opportunity to put TPM and next gen to work. So the things that happened, we went through this collaborative process of bringing people together. And if you've run either of these programs already, TPM or NextGen, you know it's a big step just to explain what you're trying to put on, why they need to be a part of it, what it's going to entail. And so we did that all with NextGen. And then we had this added burden, I guess I would say, or at least we thought so at the time, of saying, okay, great, you're doing NextGen, and now we also want you to learn about TPM. And so we learned a lot in that process. I'm telling these things sequentially, but there was a lot of time in between when we launched the Next Gen Sector Partnership that we had for manufacturing. We had about 40 manufacturers, and then we had a workforce committee. And then as we started working with that workforce committee, we talked about bringing in the TPM process. And to be honest with you, that conversation really went nowhere for the first 6 weeks, I would say, of us discussing it at multiple meetings. Just because there was overload of terminology. They're like, you just got me to sign up for this next gen. Now, what are you talking about? TPM? What is that? unclear. We had some uncertainty amongst all of us if, hey, have we satisfied enough of what we're doing, what we're trying to accomplish with next gen to be at the point to move on to TPM? Is everyone ready about what we're trying to accomplish even within this committee? But we kept having those conversations. Aaron and I had lots of conversations through it. Aaron was was supporting our collaboratives that we had in Greater New Haven, and she was great help. I talked to Jamie a couple times as well, and Nikki as well, talking about how do we actually implement TPM in this process. And what we ended up doing was we just got rid of the terminology, which I think is a great thing about TPM. If you used TPM before, you know that it's a very flexible system. There's a great roadmap for you to follow, but there's always exit ramps to find what works best for you and your region. And so that's what we did in Greater New Haven with our manufacturing collaborative. Was we just said, hey, you know what? We're not even going to say TPM. We're not going to say talent pipeline management. We're not going to throw any more names of processes at you. But hey, we want to know what's the most critical job for your organizations. Let's have a conversation about that. So we did all the steps of TPM just without the terminology. And that seemed to make a huge difference of that we weren't trying to sell people into another program. And I know it's not, you're not selling people into TPM because it's something that's going to be really beneficial for them. But I think there was hesitancy. And we always find with manufacturers just in general, especially compared to our bioscience companies, manufacturers have been around the block. They've seen lots of different programs come through. So they're always a little bit more suspicious of, well, what's this going to be? How is this going to be different than something that someone else tried 10 years ago and that didn't work? So really moving away from programs, terminology, and just getting into the work of what jobs are going to be most important. I'll fast forward really quickly, and then we can start getting into some of the questions. We had a really successful process. Everyone coalesced around the concepts. We then did start using the terminology of TPM, just so we were all talking the same language. Once we had everyone on board of what we were doing and they could see the process that we were following, then we were really comfortable bringing the language back into it. We conducted a survey. It was, as you always hear in TPM, extremely enlightening. I think we had 14 companies that completed that survey, and of them, there were 432 openings over 2 years for machine operators. And so it was just one of those aha moments. Happens all the time in TPM where everyone looked at it and said, wow. And we actually, for that group, surveyed about 12 different positions because there really was a lot of disarray as to what everyone thought the most important position was for their organization. Went along that process, really kept the framework of Next Gen along with TPM. And I think that combination of the two programs gave us great sustainability. And then lo and behold, Connecticut as a state applied for the Good Jobs Challenge grant and was successful with it. And so both our manufacturing and our bioscience collaboratives have funding that are coming through the Good Jobs Challenge grant. And in fact, those dollars have just started to flow. So really it was the structure. I know the state of Connecticut in making their Good Jobs Challenge grant pitch was that we have these regional sector partnerships. We have a infrastructure for having feedback from industry into workforce. And we felt the work that we did around TPM, we really were able to provide detailed data and share that upstream to all of our different partners. Next slide. I'm going to quickly go through these next few bullet points because these are kind of my key takeaways, but I'm sure they'll come up into our questions as well. So pick your battles. I put that out there of, you know, I could have kept insisting, no, we have to call it TPM. We have to follow this strictly, but there was no point in that. We were trying to get the work done. So it's really important to choose when you need to label something or when is it important to be true to the program. I think if you're true to the work, then the programs will definitely follow along. And I think everyone on here would agree with that. Take the best of both approaches. Both programs are really flexible and allow for that. And everyone's region, your industries, your relationships are different. And so you really have to find something that works for you. As you heard me say, limit the terminology. That can become overwhelming. It makes people at certain points feel like they're having to buy into something or commit far greater than they actually have to. So use it sparingly or when you feel like you need to. As I've said in these other, I think this goes across all of these, always be flexible as you're going through the process, and keep using different techniques. One thing I've found now that we're in year 3 of running our collaboratives, we're constantly trying to reinvent how the collaboratives are set up so that we can keep them moving forward into the next year. And what worked in year 1 doesn't necessarily work in year 3 because we have different people who have stepped up. We just need to keep the energy and the life going in it to be able to keep moving forward. So I think changing the approaches that you have, and each system offers different approaches that you can use at different times, can be very helpful as you try to keep these extended, keep the life of them going for a long period of time.
Awesome. Thanks, Garrett. I think like just quickly kind of reacting, and we can pull the slides down at this point, to both Kylie and Garrett. You know, you hear so many similarities in your approaches. It's almost like y'all were like part of a working group on this, right? Like you actually did it completely separately in your own regions, worked through it organically, had experimentation. And I think, Garrett, you know, one thing that you didn't get into detail about, but that's really interesting, is that you've done TPM / next gen with 3 different, you mentioned the manufacturing and the bioscience, then you've also used TPM with healthcare, and it's played out differently in each partnership, even within your region. And then Kylie, you talked about the differences just with it, you know, between manufacturing and construction in your region. So I think that mindset of like going into this flexibly and or you know with as much flexibility as you can, and putting those together is really important as we talk through in the discussion how regions can use them together. So like, even though these approaches, like there's a lot in common in terms of the strengths that NextGen brings, the strengths that TPM brings, and how you guys identified those. Even within your own regions, you see differences in how they've played out. And Garrett, I wonder if you want to talk a little bit more about that, just with your 3 different collaboratives.
Yeah, no, thanks, Erin. That's a great point. So we do have these 3 different collaboratives. They are very different. Bioscience, in New Haven, we have Yale University with really growing and strong bioscience sector. The manufacturing I spoke with, even the geography is different. So our bioscience one is very New Haven city centric, although it does have some statewide applications as well. Our manufacturing covers 2 counties in Connecticut, and we don't really use counties in Connecticut, but just to illustrate, so it covers both New Haven County and Middlesex County. And then our healthcare was born out of maybe my frustrations earlier on in the process. And so I said, you know what, we need to just do a TPM collaborative. So we kind of did it off on the side. And it was a good way for us to get right into TPM, but then we added NextGen layered on top of it once we got that established. And I'll start by saying with the healthcare, we already had really strong relationships with all of our healthcare providers as part of the chamber. Felt really connected with them. Our hospital is a huge contributor to the chamber. And so with the healthcare collaborative, we felt like we were already at the workforce conversation. And we just like jump right into it because that's what they were talking about at the time every single day, and they still are. This is back during the pandemic and all of the workforce shortages. In fact, the biggest bar we had to get over with them was this isn't going to solve your problem tomorrow, but it is going to start addressing problems down the road. And then the bioscience, I'll just say quickly, we've used pieces of TPM so far, but we have not fully implemented the TPM process, although I think that's going to, we'll hopefully do that in the next couple of months here. And the reason for that is, again, it's a very small, comparatively small industry. So we probably have 50 bioscience related companies, which is a decent amount, but they're all different sizes. Some are very small startups. A few are Pfizer's and AstraZeneca's and things like that. And so they're much larger organizations. And then there's a few in the middle. And so they're all just very different. And so to run TPM is a lot more challenging because they're not homogenous in what their needs are, and finding that key point. They all need high level PhDs who have incredible science that they figured out. But TPM doesn't always necessarily work best for that. We are starting to hone in on research assistant, lab tech, lab ops. And as part of the Good Jobs Challenge, we need to do a workforce study. And so we are going to use the TPM process for that. And I'll just say, because I know we have Muriel from our team at the Chamber on, and then Ann Benowitz, who has really spearheaded all three of our collaboratives as well. So it's a team approach in how we go about this.
Great, thanks, Garrett. Kylie, I wanted to go back to you, and I know you started to talk a little bit about benefits and strengths of each approach, but wanted to give you a chance if there's more you wanted to add on that question of, what are the benefits of strengths of using NextGen, TPM, and using them together?
Yeah, I mean, I think Francie brought up a good point earlier. It's just them creating the agenda, right? And NextGen really does that work in terms of bringing those employers to the table, having them say, this is what we want to work on, and then also giving them that framework to do it. Because I think what I've seen or heard from the past in terms of partnerships is just when workforce is identified and industry is, they're just like, what do they want to do? And what they want to do is sometimes what is just already in front of them. So you see a lot of career fairs and career exposure events happening. And is that truly solving the problem? And so that's where TPM comes in, to where you're saying, okay, what is the data showing, and what is the capacity that we need to build to actually close these gaps in our growing industry? So I think just emphasizing that it gives structure to the actual problem and still puts them at the forefront without them feeling like we're disregarding. I think career fairs are good, but how do you put structure behind what positions to focus on when you do a career fair or career exposure? It would be nice now that we know machinist is a need. Why don't we have a machinist emphasis and see some movement there and see action? Cami is always the one to say you can't boil the ocean. So that is one thing that TPM also doesn't allow us to do. We can't focus on the whole thing. We have to start in small increments. So working together is nice.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that there's so many great nuggets in the chat, and Bree just put in career fairs are the quick wins and TPM gives us the long-term wins. And I think, from what I've seen with regions is, TPM is one of the ways you can use data, right? There are other ways too, but it's pretty easy to plug and play. And there is that process of like a region having to go through that additional conversation, Garrett, that you referenced, like how do we do that workforce analysis and what do we draw on? So if there is kind of, an organization with that strength in TPM already in your region, it makes sense to use that as a starting point. I have a question for Kylie and Garrett that I'd love to get folks to respond to in the chat as well, which is, one of the other things we talk about with NextGen is that when industry sets the agenda, they care about more than workforce, and they set other priorities. So we'd love to hear, like, what are some of the other priorities that your partnerships or collaboratives have set? And in the chat, anybody who has a NextGen sector partnership, if you want to drop in some of your unique priorities, would love to see those. I see a lot of commentary in the chat, but not so many questions. So you can also raise your hand if you have a question for one of our speakers.
Yeah, I'll say, Aaron, too. I mean, cost of doing business, programs that are workforce related but don't fall to just into TPM. So we have an internship program with our bioscience collaborative that started before we did anything with TPM. Regulatory policy issues. And it's just a great way to set a table and bring partners around. I feel like the initial reaction of a chamber when they first hear about NextGen or maybe even TPM is that, well, I already do this. I already talk to my businesses and speak to them. But it really was enlightening when you sit around the table with those industry partners, with them all together, because that's what usually does not occur. And they said that all the time, like, wow, I never get together with all my colleagues in this type of setting. And so it really does having next gen gives you a lot of freedom to bring up different types of topics.
Yeah, and I think Bobby put it in the chat for Colorado, which aligns to the construction sector partnership, is like permitting and process and policy has definitely been a high need in construction, because in Colorado alone, you need so many permits and approvals just for different cities and surroundings. I think one of the contractors mentioned that they have like 45 that they have just to operate as a business throughout the state of Colorado. So that is definitely a big pain point in construction, along with in advanced manufacturing. They just talked mostly about talent being one, but then community awareness. Like, how do we, now that we know what our key positions are, how do we promote that more to get individuals aware of the opportunity? And they also highlighted supply chain, which we are fortunate. I think Manufacturers Edge is throughout the US, so they have a really cool platform
They're
that
the
we were able
MEP
to
Center.
get.
They have
Yep.
different names in every state. It's the MEP Center.
Oh, okay, cool. That's good. But they are definitely, they were a good quick win for the supply chain because they are working on that diligently in Colorado. So, and it's just interesting once you connect, because everybody is having aha moments of like, I never knew that existed. And you're just like, yeah, it's
Yeah.
there. So
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. And we do have a couple of questions that came in the chat. So would love to go to Ben's question. What's a best practice to not duplicate efforts with a defined region? So having 2 advanced manufacturing groups, 2 tech groups, 2 healthcare groups, or should each group organize around their focus, workforce, access to capital, supply chain? Ben, is there anything else you want to add on your question? Garrett, Kylie, is that, or, Francie and Nikki, feel free to jump in as well. Francie, go ahead. I see you just.
Yeah, I'm happy to weigh in. And Ben, I hope I'm interpreting your question correctly. This is part of why we so emphasize the agenda of a Next Gen partnership being flexible, because when we organize these tables around our agendas, where there's sort of the training table over here and there's a transportation table over here, it often can mean that we're spreading employers really thin. So we recommend the Next Gen partnership be really positioned to be the go-to forum for a single sector. So ideally, it's the coordinating body for the targeted sector within a region. And that means, you might have a team that's focused on TPM that's going deep. You might have another team focused on policy advocacy, but it's coordinated in a central spot so that we're not asking employers to go to 4 different places. We're coming to one place. Ultimately, that's the goal. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that's helpful. Sorry, I had a hard time unmuting. Yeah, I think we want to guard against 4 different people calling the same 10 employers to go to 4 different meetings. And yeah, the burnout factor for HR reps or subject matter experts or even CEOs. And I think Colorado is making huge strides in that. And so that's helpful to know that is the more, not consolidation, but streamlining you can do, and then just have subgroups under that bigger umbrella.
yeah, sorry.
I was just going to say, just to add on to what Francie was talking about from the structure of the groups. I mean, that's part of, I think, what we're all trying to accomplish here, is to make sure that we aren't duplicating efforts. And in fact, if you think about some of the data that you're able to collect through this, or the surveying process that happens too, this goes even beyond maybe who are the kind of the key people at the table. If you think about the advisory boards that typically employers are being asked to sit on, whether that's from an education standpoint, whether that's from another, workforce entity within the region, how can we utilize these convening, these coordinating bodies, as Francie was talking about, as the way to collect information and disseminate it back to those other people who are asking for it too, right? So it's not just consolidating on where we are asking them to be, right? But on where they're being asked to be in other places within the community as well. And so then they're not being over-surveyed, over-questioned, asked for their time in multiple meetings. And the San Diego region, they're actually helping and coordinating, getting the information that the community colleges want when they're asking for employers to be on an advisory board, right? Well, we're already going to survey them on these things. What are the additional questions that you need answered, right? So imagine that as a benefit as well. Or if you
Francie.
want to go just
Oh,
one level
sorry, go ahead,
further
Nikki.
on
Yeah.
the data piece, right? In Kentucky, the data that they get from their employer collaboratives is now feeding back into their state labor market information system, right? So there are a lot of different ways in which you could look at how this is kind of helping to align and alleviate that duplication.
Great. Francie, there are a few like next gen specific questions in the chat, and I know you've been responding to them, but a few that I think, or at least one that I want to pull out for you to respond to so everybody hears your answer. With TPM, we do a lot of work with employers only at the table, especially at the beginning to get organized, build trust. With the next gen diagram shown with the table set up, how does it work with everyone present?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I appreciate these questions in the chat, and please keep them coming. So, so here's the real scoop. We can describe this diagram where it really looks clean and you've got industry at the table and all the partners around the outside. Functionally, the way it works is that a next gen sector partnership is organized around action teams. And it's the industry leaders that define, what do we want to get done? Action teams have very defined objectives, they have defined scopes, they've got deliverables, and business people are really good at this. Business people are really good at kind of breaking down big, complex, messy issues and saying, let's get a work plan. What are we going to do over the next 3-6 months? That's where the partners start to be engaged in meaningful ways. So I see colleagues from Washington, D.C. on the line. This partnership is fresh in my mind. We just had a meeting of a construction sector partnership in D.C. In this case, the marketing team has a big mandate to get, careers in construction more on the radar. They've got really specific strategies. They've created a website. They've created a brand. There's an industry education partnerships team. They've got a schedule of events and ways to partner with schools. Both of those teams have different public partner organizations plugging in and supporting them. So it is public-private. This is not a y'all come, everybody trying to do everything together. The distinction is that it's organized around the work. What are we trying to get done? It's the business leaders who are invested in keeping the focus on that work. And then we're pulling partners in rather than trying to recruit industry, to specific initiatives that are more driven by public partners.
Thanks, Francie. We have like 2 minutes left. So I'm going to do 1 minute to Francie, 1 minute to Nikki. So Francie, you can stay unmuted if you want. Nikki, Francie, share a final takeaway and or how people can get more information and stay connected with NextGen or TPM. Go ahead, Francie.
So nextgensectorpartnerships.com, we'll put that in the chat. That's where we put all of our toolkit and training manual, and we try to make this, as accessible and ever updating as possible. Also sign up for our mailing list. We do these types of calls on a regular basis and try to facilitate connections across our national network and community of practice. I'll also put my direct email in the chat if anybody's got follow-up questions, but nextgensectorpartnerships.com. Thank you, Melinda, is your spot.
Great. Nikki, you're up.
Sorry, my cursor disappeared and I couldn't unmute myself. Jamie, if you could help me just putting in the chat some of the links to our website, tpmacademy.org. We'll also pop an email in there. So if you have specific questions that we can help you get those sorted out. But you'll also get the slide deck after this. And there were a few QR codes that I provided on the final slide of my presentation that includes a link to our website as well as to our online training. So you can go through the TPM Academy process in a variety of ways, but one of the great things that we've been able to develop over the last couple of years is an online on-demand version. So you can really start learning about it tonight if you're so inclined, and start going through the training on your own. We also have blended live learning sessions. So that's a virtual cohort that you participate in. And then we can also bring the framework to your community if you want to train a larger group of people. But if you have any questions, we're more than happy to help answer those for you and think through how you can use both of these frameworks together.
Perfect. Thank you, Nikki. Thank you, Francie. And huge thanks to Garrett and Kylie for sharing their experience and their tips and tricks. Always appreciate connecting with you all. Thank you. Thanks for joining. Take care.